The stagecoach had smelled like sweat, leather, and broken dreams long before the bullets started flying. Elena Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the window frame, watching the Pennsylvania green fade into endless brown as they rolled deeper into frontier territory. 3 days of bone-rattling travel had left her exhausted, filthy, and angrier than she'd ever been in her 23 years of carefully constructed life. She'd left Philadelphia wearing black silk mourning clothes worth more than most frontier families earned in a year. Now those same clothes were covered in trail dust, the hem torn from climbing in and out of way stations that barely qualified as buildings. The other passengers, a circuit preacher with yellowed teeth, a mining company clerk who hadn't stopped sweating since St. Louis, and a farmer's wife clutching a baby, kept stealing glances at her like she was an exotic bird that had flown into the wrong climate. They weren't wrong. "Miss Whitmore, you sure about this teaching position?" The preacher leaned forward, his breath reeking of tobacco. "Red Hollow ain't exactly refined society." Elena met his eyes with the same cold stare she'd used on Philadelphia socialites who'd whispered about her father's gambling debts at his funeral. "I wasn't aware I asked for your counsel, Reverend." The man sat back, properly chastised. The farmer's wife smirked behind her baby's blanket. Truth was, Elena wasn't sure about anything anymore. 6 months ago, she'd been planning her engagement to Thomas Blackwell, a banker's son with perfect teeth and a trust fund that would have kept her in silk dresses and opera boxes for life. Then her father's heart had given out during a poker game at the Union Club, and Elena discovered that Harrison Whitmore, the man who'd given her everything, had left her with nothing but debts, shame, and a reputation so damaged that Thomas broke their engagement in a letter delivered by his attorney. The teaching contract had arrived 2 weeks later, forwarded by a distant cousin who worked for the Territorial Education Board. Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Population 214. Salary, $40 monthly plus room and board. It was charity disguised as opportunity, and Elena hated charity almost as much as she hated the men who'd smiled at her father's funeral while calculating how to divide his assets. But pride didn't pay rent, and staying in Philadelphia meant becoming someone's mistress or someone's burden. The frontier might be brutal, but at least it was honest about wanting to kill you. The stagecoach lurched over another rut. The baby started crying again. "How much longer?" the mining clerk asked the driver through the front window. 2 hours to the Red Hollow way station if we don't break an axle," came the shouted reply. "Assuming the weather holds." Elena looked at the cloudless sky and wondered what weather the man was worried about. Then she saw the canyon walls rising on either side of the trail and understood. This wasn't weather territory. This was ambush territory. She'd read enough dime novels to know how these stories went. Her hand moved unconsciously to the small derringer hidden in a pocket sewn into her skirts. Her father had given it to her 3 years ago after a servant was attacked near their Philadelphia townhouse. "Never point it unless you mean to use it," he'd said, teaching her to load the 2 small chambers. "And if you use it, aim for the chest. You only get 2 shots." She'd never fired it at anything living, wasn't sure she could. The preacher was talking again, something about divine providence and the Lord's plan for frontier settlement, but Elena stopped listening. The canyon walls were getting higher, the shadows deeper. The cheerful afternoon sunlight that had followed them all morning suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. The driver shouted something, then the world exploded. The first gunshot hit the driver square in the chest. Elena saw the impact, saw the man's body jerk backward, saw blood spray across the horses' heads. The reins went slack. The horses panicked, screaming and bucking against their harnesses. The stagecoach careened sideways. Elena slammed into the preacher, who slammed into the clerk, who crashed into the door. The farmer's wife was screaming, clutching her baby against her chest. More gunshots. Wood splintered near Elena's head. She dropped to the floor, her expensive mourning dress twisting around her legs. "Everybody out, now! Hands where we can see 'em!" The voice came from outside, rough and certain. Elena's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. This wasn't a dime novel. This was real. The blood on the window was real. The driver slumped in his seat was real. The door flew open. A man in a dust-covered coat pointed a rifle at the preacher's face. "I said out. You deaf or stupid?" They climbed out into hell. 4 riders surrounded the stagecoach, all armed, all masked with bandanas that did nothing to hide the violence in their eyes. The horses had stopped their panic, but were still wild-eyed, foaming at their bits. The driver's body had fallen halfway off the coach, one arm dangling grotesquely. "Line up," the tallest rider ordered. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, rifle resting casually across his lap. Everything valuable on the ground. Money, jewelry, watches. Don't make me ask twice. The mining clerk immediately started emptying his pockets, his hands shaking so badly he dropped coins in the dirt. The preacher stood frozen, his mouth moving in silent prayer. The farmer's wife clutched her baby and cried. Elena's mind was racing. She had $17 in her handbag, everything she owned in the world. The derringer was pressing against her thigh through her skirts. 2 shots, 4 men. Mathematics had never been crueler. "You," the tall rider pointed his rifle at Elena. "The lady in the fancy dress. Let's see that bag." She handed it over, meeting his eyes. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw beneath the bandana. He opened her bag, rifled through it, found her money. $17. "That's it?" He looked at her dress, at the clearly expensive fabric. "You're dressed like money, but carrying like poverty. Interesting." "Family circumstances changed recently," Elena said, keeping her voice level. "You're robbing a schoolteacher. Congratulations." One of the other riders laughed. "She's got spine, this one." "Spine don't stop bullets," the tall rider said. He pocketed her money and tossed the bag back to her. Then his eyes traveled down to her hand. "That a wedding ring?" Elena's throat went dry. Her mother's ring. The only thing of value she had left, and she'd been stupid enough to wear it because it made her feel less alone. "It belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "Belonged?" the man repeated. "Past tense, so she don't need it no more, does she? Please. Hand it over, or I'll cut your finger off and take it anyway. Your choice, schoolteacher." Elena's hand went to the derringer. She didn't think, didn't plan, just pulled it from her skirts and raised it in one smooth motion, aiming at the man's chest exactly like her father taught her. The canyon went absolutely silent. 4 rifles swung toward her. The farmer's wife gasped. The preacher whispered something that might have been a prayer or a curse. The tall rider stared at her for 3 long seconds. Then he started laughing. "Look at this! Little Philadelphia girl thinks she's Wild Bill Hickok." He leaned forward in his saddle, utterly unafraid. "That's a lady's derringer, sweetheart. You got 2 shots, maybe. There's 4 of us, and we got rifles. You really think you're walking away from this?" Elena's hand was shaking. The gun felt impossibly heavy. She could smell her own sweat, her own fear. Her finger was on the trigger, but she couldn't make herself pull it, couldn't cross that final line between threat and action. The rider saw it, saw her weakness. "That's what I thought." He raised his rifle. "Now put down the The canyon exploded with gunfire, but this time it wasn't aimed at the stagecoach. One of the riders simply fell off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The sound of the shot came a split second later, a rifle crack echoing off the canyon walls from somewhere above them. The tall rider spun his horse. "What the—" Another shot, another rider down, his chest blooming red. "Ambush! Move!" The tall rider was shouting now, all his casual confidence gone. The remaining riders kicked their horses into motion, trying to scatter, trying to find cover. They didn't make it far. A man stepped out from behind a rock formation 30 yards away, and Elena's first thought was that he looked like death itself had learned to walk. Tall, over 6 feet easy, wearing a long coat that had seen hard use and a hat pulled low over his face. He had a rifle in his hands and a gun belt around his waist, and he moved with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing exactly how dangerous he was. He fired twice more, working the lever action on his rifle like it was an extension of his body. One shot took down the third rider. The other hit the tall rider's horse, and the animal went down screaming. The tall rider rolled clear, came up firing. His shot went wild. The stranger's didn't. The bullet caught the tall rider in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skittering away across the rocks. Then there was silence again. The kind of silence that comes after violence, where the world is still ringing with echoes and your ears haven't caught up to the fact that the shooting has stopped. The stranger walked toward them, his rifle still raised, his eyes scanning the canyon for any remaining threats. Up close, Elena could see the details her fear had missed. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen things that would break most men. A scar cut through his left eyebrow. His jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble. There was a silver badge pinned to his coat, a sheriff's star, worn and scratched from use. He stopped in front of the wounded rider, kicked the man's rifle further away, then looked at the stagecoach passengers for the first time. "Anybody hit?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. The preacher shook his head mutely. The mining clerk was sitting on the ground, looking like he might vomit. The farmer's wife had turned away, covering her baby's face. Elena realized she was still holding the derringer, still pointing it at nothing. Her hand was shaking so badly the gun was wobbling. She tried to lower it, but her muscles wouldn't respond. Shock, some distant part of her brain supplied. "You're in shock." The stranger walked over to her, moving slowly like you might approach a spooked horse. He reached out and gently pushed the derringer down until it was pointing at the ground. "Easy," he said quietly. "It's over." Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something flicker in those cold eyes. Recognition? No, that didn't make sense. They'd never met. "You Elena Whitmore?" he asked. Every nerve in her body went on alert. "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the wounded rider who was clutching his shoulder and trying to crawl toward the rocks. The stranger walked over, planted a boot on the man's back, and pushed him flat. "Silas Kane," the stranger said, reading the man's face like a wanted poster. "You got 7 murders on your head and a $1,000 bounty in 3 territories. You picked a bad day for robbery." "Go to hell, Mercer," the wounded man spat. Mercer. Elena's mind caught on the name. She'd heard it in St. Louis, whispered in the way stationed by men who looked over their shoulders when they spoke. Colt Mercer, the frontier lawman who'd cleaned up Deadwood after Wild Bill was murdered. The sheriff who'd hunted down the Taylor gang after they massacred a homesteader family. The man they said never missed a shot and never showed mercy. Mercer pulled out a length of rope and tied Silas Kane's hands behind his back with efficient, practiced movements. Then he checked the other 3 riders, all dead, before walking back to the stagecoach. "Driver's gone," he said, his voice flat. "One of you know how to handle a team?" The mining clerk raised his hand weakly. I worked freight wagons in Missouri." "Good enough. Get the body down and get those horses calm. We need to move before Kane's friends show up." Mercer looked at the rest of them. "Get back in the coach, now." They moved. Elena's legs felt like water, but she climbed back into the stagecoach, the derringer still clutched in her numb hand. The farmer's wife sat across from her, rocking her baby and crying silently. The preacher was praying again, louder this time. Mercer secured Kane to the back of the stagecoach, then mounted his own horse, a big buckskin that looked as hard-used as his owner. He rode up beside Elena's window. "Miss Whitmore, when we get to Red Hollow, you need to come to my office. We got business to discuss." Elena's stomach dropped. "What business?" "Your father's business. Harrison Whitmore owed me money. A lot of it." The world tilted sideways. "That's impossible. His debts were settled. His attorney didn't know about this particular debt," Mercer said. His eyes were hard, unreadable. "Or the contract that came with it." "What contract?" Mercer looked at her for a long moment, and Elena saw something in his face that might have been regret, or maybe just exhaustion. "The one where he signed over his daughter's hand in marriage as collateral." The words hit her like a physical blow. For a second, Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The canyon walls seemed to be closing in, the afternoon sun suddenly too bright, too hot. That's insane. That's not legal. You can't." "It's legal enough in territory jurisdiction," Mercer said. "Your father signed it in front of witnesses, had it notarized. It's binding." "No." Elena's voice came out broken, desperate. "No, my father wouldn't, he wouldn't do that to me." Mercer's expression didn't change. "Your father did a lot of things you probably didn't know about, Miss Whitmore. This is just one of them." He kicked his horse and rode ahead, leaving Elena staring after him in numb disbelief. The stagecoach lurched into motion. The mining clerk was driving now, his hands white-knuckled on the reins. They rolled past the bodies of the 3 dead outlaws, past the spreading pools of blood darkening the canyon dirt. Elena looked down at the derringer still in her hand. 2 shots. She hadn't fired either one, hadn't been able to cross that line, and now she was heading toward a future she couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares. Married to a frontier lawman she'd just met, bound by a contract her dead father had signed, trapped in a territory where violence was currency and mercy was weakness. The farmer's wife was watching her. "You all right, miss?" Elena almost laughed. "All right." The word didn't even make sense anymore. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know anything anymore." The stagecoach rolled on toward Red Hollow, carrying Elena toward a destiny she never chose and couldn't escape. Red Hollow appeared on the horizon 2 hours later, and Elena's heart sank with every yard they traveled closer. She'd expected a rough frontier town. What she saw was barely qualified as a settlement. Maybe 20 buildings total, most of them looking like a strong wind would knock them over. The main street was unpaved dirt, rutted from wagon wheels and horse traffic. A saloon, a general store, a building that might have been a hotel, and a few other structures she couldn't identify at this distance. At the far end of town, she could see a building with bars on the windows. The jail, presumably. Everything was brown. Brown buildings, brown dirt, brown mountains in the distance. Even the sky seemed faded here, washed out by endless sun and wind. "Welcome to paradise," the mining clerk muttered, pulling the stagecoach to a stop in front of the general store. A small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in towns this size. Elena watched through the window as Mercer dismounted and started hauling Silas Kane off the back of the stagecoach. The outlaw was still bleeding, still cursing, but Mercer handled him like he weighed nothing. "That's Silas Kane," someone in the crowd shouted. "I'll be damned. Mercer actually got him." "Told you he would," another voice answered. "Mercer always gets his man." Elena forced herself to step down from the stagecoach. Her legs were stiff, her whole body aching from the rough ride and the aftermath of terror. The crowd's attention shifted to her immediately. A woman in expensive mourning clothes was apparently more interesting than a captured outlaw. "Who's the lady?" someone asked. "That's the new schoolteacher," the farmer's wife said, climbing down with her baby. "Came all the way from Philadelphia. Got held up by Kane's gang on the Canyon Road." The crowd's interest intensified. Elena could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. A woman in a flour-dusted apron stepped forward. "Miss Whitmore? I'm Sarah Chen. I run the boarding house. We got a room ready for you." Elena grabbed onto the kindness like a drowning woman finding driftwood. Thank you. Thank you. Let me help you with your trunk." Sarah gestured to a young man in the crowd, who immediately jumped to comply. "You must be exhausted, and terrified, I'd imagine, after that business on the road." Elena started, then stopped. She didn't know what she was. Exhausted, yes. Terrified, absolutely, but also angry, confused, and increasingly aware that she was standing in the middle of a dirt street in a town that looked like it was one drought away from ceasing to exist. "Miss Whitmore!" Mercer's voice cut through the crowd noise. He'd handed Kane off to a deputy, a younger man with a nervous face, and was walking toward her. "My office, now!" Sarah's expression tightened. "Sheriff, the poor girl just survived an ambush. Can't this wait until—" "No," Mercer said flatly. "It can't." Elena met his eyes. In the full afternoon light, she could see more details. The lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. The way his right hand never strayed far from his gun. The absolute certainty in his posture that he would be obeyed. She'd grown up around powerful men, politicians, bankers, industrialists who commanded rooms with their presence. But they'd wielded social power, economic power. Mercer wielded something more primal, the power of a man who'd killed 4 people in as many minutes and would likely kill more before the week was out. "Fine," Elena said. "Lead the way." The crowd parted as they walked toward the jail. Elena was aware of the whispers following them, the speculation. By nightfall, everyone in Red Hollow would know the new schoolteacher had private business with Sheriff Mercer. The jail was better built than most of the other structures. Thick walls, solid door, bars on the windows that looked like they'd actually hold someone. Inside, it was sparse and functional. A desk, a gun rack, wanted posters on the walls, and a door leading to what were probably the cells. Mercer closed the door behind them and gestured to a chair. "Sit." "I'd rather stand," Elena said, her voice colder than she intended. Suit yourself. Mercer opened a desk drawer and pulled out a leather folder. He set it on the desk between them. Your father borrowed $5,000 from me 3 years ago. The loan terms were clear, 5% interest, payment due within 18 months. He never paid a cent. Elena's throat was dry. $5,000? For what? Your mother's medical care. Mercer opened the folder, pulled out papers covered in neat handwriting. She was dying of consumption. The doctors back east said she needed to go to a sanatorium in Colorado if she wanted any chance of survival. Your father didn't have that kind of money. He'd already gambled away most of his fortune. But he loved your mother, so he borrowed from me. Elena felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Her mother had died 4 years ago, after spending 8 months at a facility in the Rocky Mountains. Elena had never questioned how her father paid for it, never thought to ask. The money bought her 8 extra months, Mercer continued, his voice carefully neutral. Not enough to save her, but enough that she died comfortable instead of drowning in her own lungs in a Philadelphia bedroom. Your father considered that a fair trade. But $5,000? Elena's mind was reeling. That's a fortune. How could you possibly loan that much to a stranger? Your father wasn't a stranger. For the first time, something that might have been emotion flickered across Mercer's face. We served together during the war, Gettysburg. He saved my life when a rebel sharpshooter had me pinned down. I told him I owed him, and men like us don't forget debts like that. Elena sat down. Her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. But the contract, the marriage contract, you can't honestly expect— I didn't want your father to sign that contract, Mercer said quietly. I told him to pay me back when he could, that I trusted his word, but he insisted. Said if anything happened to him, he wanted to make sure his daughter was protected. He made me promise that if he died before paying the debt, I'd come find you and honor the agreement. Protected? Elena's voice cracked. He sold me. To a stranger. How is that protection? Mercer's jaw tightened. Look around you, Miss Whitmore. Look at this town, at this territory. Women don't survive out here alone. Not refined Eastern women with no frontier skills and no family to back them up. Your father knew that. He knew what would happen to you if you tried to make it on your own. So instead, I'm supposed to marry you? A man I met 3 hours ago? A man who kills people for a living? I don't kill people for a living, Mercer said, his voice hard. I enforce the law. Sometimes that means killing people who need killing. There's a difference. Is there? Elena stood up, her hands shaking with rage and fear. You shot 4 men today. 4. Do you even remember their names? Silas Kane, Martin Weatherby, Cole Jackson, Thomas Pike. Mercer rattled off the names like he was reading a grocery list. Kane had 7 murders. Weatherby had 5 and raped a homesteader's daughter. Jackson killed a mail carrier for $12. Pike was wanted for arson and attempted murder in Colorado. Those are the men I shot today. You want me to feel bad about it? Elena didn't have an answer for that. Mercer pulled another paper from the folder. This is the contract your father signed. It's legal under territorial law. You can read it yourself. He pushed the paper across the desk toward her. But I'll give you a choice your father didn't include. You can walk away. Elena froze. What? You can leave. Take the teaching job, live in Sarah's boarding house, and we'll call the debt settled. I won't force you into anything. For a moment, Elena felt hope rising in her chest. Then reality crashed back down. Except I can't take the teaching job without your permission, can I? She said slowly. Because you're the law here. And if you decide I'm a poor moral influence on the children because I refuse to honor my father's contract, the school board would listen to you. Mercer didn't deny it. And living alone in a frontier town as an unmarried woman with a reputation for dishonoring debts, Elena continued, her voice bitter. How long before someone decides I owe them something too? How long before I can't walk down the street without being harassed? I'd protect you, Mercer said quietly. Why? Out of the goodness of your heart? Elena laughed, and it sounded broken even to her own ears. You're giving me a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Marry you or survive alone in a place designed to destroy women like me. That's not freedom, Sheriff. That's just a prettier cage. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it yet. Your father loved you, Miss Whitmore. Everything he did, the loan, the contract, all of it, was because he loved you, and wanted you safe. He knew the kind of men back east who'd circle you after he died, men who'd use you up and throw you away. He trusted me to be different. Because you saved his life in a war 20 years ago? Because I'm the only man he knew who wouldn't break you. Mercer stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the dusty street. I don't want a wife who hates me. I don't want someone bound to me by debt and desperation. But I made a promise to a dying friend, and I keep my promises. So yes, Miss Whitmore, I'm offering you a choice that isn't much of a choice, but it's still more than most women get out here. Elena looked at the contract on the desk. Her father's signature was there at the bottom, next to Mercer's. Both men agreeing to trade her future like she was property. But as much as she hated it, Mercer was right about one thing. Alone, she wouldn't survive out here. She had no money, no skills that mattered on the frontier, and no family to protect her. The teaching job might give her a roof and meals, but it wouldn't give her safety, not real safety. And if she went back east, what was waiting for her there? The same whispers, the same shame, the same parade of men who'd see her father's debts as an opportunity. At least Mercer was honest about what he was. If I agree to this, Elena said slowly, I want terms of my own. Mercer turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. I'm listening. I want my own bedroom. I want the freedom to move around town without asking your permission. I want to continue as the school teacher. That's my work, not yours to take away. And I want your word that you won't. She couldn't finish the sentence, her face burning. Won't force myself on you, Mercer finished for her, his voice flat. You have my word. I'm not that kind of man. How do I know that? You don't. But you don't have a lot of options right now, so you'll have to take the risk. He walked back to the desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I'll put it in writing if you want. Your own room, your independence, your job, all of it. He wrote quickly, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a man who lived by violence. When he finished, he signed it and pushed it across the desk to her. There. Legal and binding, same as your father's contract. You want time to think about it? Elena looked at the paper, looked at Mercer's hard, scarred face, looked out the window at the dusty street and the harsh mountains beyond. She thought about her father, bleeding out in a Philadelphia gentleman's club, knowing his daughter would be alone. She thought about the love that must have driven him to sign away her freedom in exchange for her safety. And she thought about the brutal honesty of a man who killed outlaws and saved strangers and kept his promises to dead friends. No, she said quietly, I don't need time. She picked up the pen, her hand steadier than she expected, and signed her name next to Mercer's. Elena Whitmore, soon to be Elena Mercer. The frontier had claimed her now, whether she wanted it or not. The wedding happened 3 days later in the same office where Elena had signed away her future. No flowers, no music, no guests except Sarah Chen, who stood as witness because the law required one, and Deputy Miller, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The circuit judge, a graying man named Thornton, who smelled like whiskey and seemed perpetually disappointed by everything, read through the ceremony in a monotone that made it sound like a business transaction, which, Elena supposed, was exactly what it was. She wore the same black morning dress she'd arrived in, now cleaned and mended by Sarah's careful hands. Mercer wore what he always wore, dark trousers, a clean shirt, his gun belt, and that long coat that had seen too much violence. He'd shaved, at least. That was something. Do you, Colt Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was confirming a prisoner's identity, not binding himself to another human being for life. And do you, Elena Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Elena looked at Mercer's face, looked at those cold eyes that had watched 4 men die without flinching, looked at the scar through his eyebrow, the hard line of his jaw, the way he stood like he was always ready for violence. Her mouth felt like sand. I do. The judge nodded, clearly ready to be done with this. Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. Mercer didn't move. Neither did Elena. An awkward silence stretched between them until Sarah cleared her throat. Well, congratulations to you both. Thanks, Mercer said. He pulled a few bills from his pocket and handed them to the judge. Appreciate you coming out on short notice. Any time, Sheriff. Thornton pocketed the money and headed for the door, clearly eager to get back to whatever bottle he'd left waiting. Deputy Miller followed him out like the building was on fire. Sarah hugged Elena, her grip tight and genuine. You need anything, you come find me. Anything at all, you understand? Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Then Sarah left too, and Elena was alone with the man who was now legally her husband. Mercer walked to his desk, started sorting through papers like nothing significant had just happened. Elena stood in the middle of the room, still wearing her morning dress, still trying to process that she'd just married a stranger in a frontier jail with no celebration, no joy, nothing but signatures and legal obligations. Your things are at my house, Mercer said without looking up. Sarah helped move them this morning. I'll walk you over when you're ready. I'm ready now. He finally looked at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Maybe surprise that she wasn't crying, maybe respect. All right then. The house was a 10-minute walk from the jail, on the northern edge of town where the buildings started giving way to open land. It was small but well built, with actual glass windows and a covered porch. Not the rough cabin Elena had been dreading, but not the Philadelphia townhouse she'd grown up in either. Mercer opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was sparse and masculine. A main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding books and supplies. 2 doors leading off the main room, bedrooms, presumably. Everything was clean but worn, functional without being comfortable. That room's yours, Mercer said, pointing to the door on the left. I'm in the other one. Kitchen's out back, separate building to keep fire risk down. Well's about 30 yards that way. He gestured vaguely. Privy's behind the kitchen. Elena walked to her room and opened the door. It was small, just a bed, a washstand, and a trunk at the foot of the bed where her belongings had been placed. But the bed had clean sheets, and there was a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was more than she'd expected, less than she'd lost. Thank you, she said quietly. Mercer nodded once. I got patrol tonight. Won't be back until morning. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. Lock the doors after I leave and don't open them for anyone but me. What if there's an emergency? Then you fire 2 shots in the air and half the town will come running. But there won't be an emergency. Red Hollow's quiet most nights. He collected his rifle from beside the door, checked his gun belt, and headed out without another word. Elena listened to his footsteps fade into the distance, then walked slowly through the empty house that was now supposedly her home. She made it to her bedroom before the tears started, made it to the narrow bed before her legs gave out, and then she cried like she hadn't let herself cry since her father's funeral, harsh, ugly sobs that tore out of her chest and left her gasping. She'd married a killer, a stranger, a man who looked at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved, and there was no way out, no escape, nothing but years and years of this cold, empty arrangement stretching ahead of her until one of them died. The frontier had swallowed her whole, and she didn't know if she'd ever find her way back to the person she used to be. Eventually, the tears stopped. Eventually, exhaustion dragged her into sleep. And when she woke in the gray light of dawn, she heard movement in the main room and remembered with fresh horror that she wasn't alone anymore. She got dressed quickly, braided her hair with shaking hands, and forced herself to walk out and face her new husband. Mercer was at the table, eating what looked like cold beans straight from a can. He glanced up when she entered, but didn't speak. Is there coffee? Elena asked. Stove's still warm. Pot should be hot enough. He went back to his beans. Elena found the pot, poured herself a cup of coffee so strong it was almost black, and sat down at the table across from him. They sat in silence, 2 strangers sharing a meal they didn't want in a house that didn't feel like home to either of them. Finally, Mercer spoke. School starts Monday. You ready? I suppose I'll have to be. The schoolhouse is the building next to the general store. Sarah's got the keys. Most of the kids are ranch children. They'll ride in for classes when their families can spare them. Don't expect more than 10 or 12 on any given day. Elena nodded, absorbing the information. They're rough, Mercer continued. Frontier kids. They've seen things, done things. They won't respect you just because you're the teacher. You'll have to earn it. I'm aware of how children work, Sheriff. It's just Mercer, or Colt, if you prefer. We're married now. Might as well use first names. The word married still felt wrong in her mouth. I'll stick with Mercer, thank you. Something that might have been disappointment crossed his face, but it vanished so quickly Elena thought she might have imagined it. He finished his beans, stood up, and grabbed his hat. "I'll be at the jail if you need anything. Deputy Miller knows to come get me if there's trouble." Then he was gone, and Elena was alone again. The first week of teaching nearly broke her. The schoolhouse was drafty, poorly lit, and furnished with benches that looked like they'd been built by someone who'd never seen a child sit down. Elena had 11 students her first day, ranging from a 6-year-old girl who could barely write her own name to a 15-year-old boy who stood almost 6 feet tall and looked at Elena like she was an insect he was deciding whether to crush. She taught briefly at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, working with daughters of wealthy families who showed up in clean dresses and knew how to curtsy. These frontier children showed up covered in dirt and manure, half of them barefoot, most of them openly skeptical that this Eastern woman had anything useful to teach them. The big 15-year-old, his name was Jake Thornton, the judge's son, was the worst. He sat in the back, made comments under his breath that the other kids snickered at, and refused to do any of the work Elena assigned. On Wednesday, Elena assigned an essay on frontier settlement. Jake turned in a blank page. "Mr. Thornton," Elena said, her voice carefully controlled, "this is unacceptable." "Can't write an essay, ma'am," Jake drawled, his tone mocking. "Nobody taught me how. Guess I need a better teacher." The other kids laughed. Elena felt her face burning but forced herself to stay calm. "Then perhaps you'd benefit from staying after class for additional instruction." "Can't do that either. Got chores at home. Pa needs me." "Your father is aware you're enrolled in school. I'm sure he'll understand." "My pa says Eastern women don't know nothing about the West and should have stayed where they belong." Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. "Says Sheriff Mercer made a mistake bringing you here." The room went absolutely silent. Every child was watching now, waiting to see how Elena would respond. She could feel her control slipping, could feel the rage building in her chest. Rage at this disrespectful child, rage at his drunk father, rage at every person in this miserable town who saw her as an outsider who didn't belong. "Get out," Elena said quietly. Jake blinked. "What?" "Get out." Her voice was louder now, harder. "You're dismissed from class. Don't come back until you can show basic respect for the educational process." Jake stood up slowly, his face darkening. "You can't kick me out. You're just the teacher. You got no authority over—" The schoolhouse door opened. Mercer stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. He must have been walking past, must have heard the commotion. "Problem here?" His voice was mild, but his eyes were locked on Jake. "No problem, Sheriff," Jake said quickly, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Just heading home early." "That right?" Mercer looked at Elena. "Mrs. Mercer?" The use of her married name in front of the students felt deliberate, territorial. Elena hated it and was grateful for it at the same time. "Mr. Thornton was being disruptive," she said carefully. "I asked him to leave." Mercer turned back to Jake. "Then I suggest you do what the teacher says." "And Jake? Your pa might not respect Eastern education, but I do. If I hear you're causing trouble in here again, we're going to have a conversation you won't enjoy. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "Get moving." Jake practically ran out of the schoolhouse. Mercer watched him go, then looked at the remaining students. "Rest of you planning to give Mrs. Mercer trouble? Or can she get back to teaching?" 10 heads shook simultaneously. "Good." Mercer touched the brim of his hat toward Elena. "Ma'am?" Then he left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Elena took a shaky breath and turned back to her class. The students were staring at her with new expressions, not quite respect, but something closer to it. Fear of her husband's authority, maybe, but she'd take what she could get. "Now then," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "let's continue with today's lesson." That night, Elena actually waited up for Mercer to come home. He arrived just after dark, looking exhausted. There was blood on his sleeve, not his own, she thought, but she didn't ask. "Thank you," she said as he hung up his gun belt. "For this afternoon." Mercer glanced at her. "Jake give you trouble again, tell me. His pa's a drunk and the boy's been running wild since his mother died. Needs someone to set boundaries." "I can handle my own classroom." "Didn't say you couldn't, but out here sometimes handling things means knowing who to call for backup." He walked to the water basin, started washing the blood off his hands. You did good, by the way. Heard from Sarah that you didn't back down, didn't cry, didn't quit. The kids are talking about it. Elena was surprised by the compliment. What are they saying? That the new teacher's tougher than she looks. That's about the best first impression you could make in Red Hollow. He dried his hands on a towel. Give it another week. They'll settle down. He was right. By the end of the second week, the students had stopped testing her quite so aggressively. Jake Thornton came back with a grudging apology and actually started doing his assignments, though he still watched her with resentment. The younger children began to warm up to her, especially when she started reading them adventure stories at the end of each day. But the adults in town were a different problem entirely. Red Hollow had maybe 200 permanent residents, and Elena quickly learned that frontier society had its own rigid hierarchy. At the top were the established ranchers and business owners, people like Samuel Brennan, who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, and Marcus Chen, who ran the general store with his wife Sarah. Then came the working people, ranch hands, miners, laborers. At the bottom were the drifters, gamblers, and those who existed on the edges of respectability. Women existed in their own separate hierarchy, and Elena's position in it was complicated. As the sheriff's wife, she theoretically held significant social standing, but as an Eastern outsider who'd arrived under scandalous circumstances, everyone in town knew about the debt and the contract by now. She was also viewed with suspicion and barely concealed hostility by the established women of Red Hollow. The worst was Victoria Brennan, Samuel's wife. Victoria was maybe 40, originally from New Orleans, and had been the uncontested queen of Red Hollow society since arriving 10 years ago with her wealthy husband. She wore dresses that must have cost a fortune to have shipped from San Francisco, hosted elaborate dinner parties, and made sure everyone knew she represented civilization in the wilderness. She hated Elena on sight. Their first real confrontation came at the general store on a Saturday morning. Elena was buying supplies, flour, coffee, a few vegetables from the small selection available, when Victoria swept in wearing a dress the color of fresh cream and a hat that probably cost more than Elena's monthly teaching salary. "Well," Victoria said loudly, her southern accent dripping with false sweetness, "if it isn't Sheriff Mercer's little acquisition." Elena's hands tightened on her shopping basket. Sarah, behind the counter, looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. "Mrs. Brennan," Elena said evenly. "Mrs. Mercer," Victoria replied, making the name sound like an insult. "I heard the most interesting story about your marriage. Something about debts and contracts? How very transactional." Other customers in the store were listening now. Elena could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting. "My marriage is my own business," Elena said quietly. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, dear." Victoria moved closer, her smile sharp as a knife. "Everything is everyone's business in a town this size. And when the sheriff brings home a wife who is quite literally purchased to settle a debt, well, people talk. Then perhaps people should find more worthwhile ways to spend their time." Victoria's smile widened. "Such spirit. I suppose that Eastern education teaches you to speak above your station. Tell me, do they also teach you how to keep a frontier man satisfied? Or did you arrive completely unprepared for your wifely duties?" The implication was clear and deliberately crude. Elena felt her face burning, felt rage rising in her throat like acid. "They taught me manners," Elena said, her voice ice cold. "Something your expensive dresses apparently can't buy." The store went dead silent. Victoria's expression turned vicious. "You little—" "Everything all right here?" Marcus Chen emerged from the back room, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. "Mrs. Mercer, I've got those supplies you ordered. Let me help you carry them home." It was a diplomatic rescue, and Elena took it gratefully. She paid for her purchases, let Marcus load them into a wooden crate, and walked out of the store with her head high, even though she was shaking with anger and humiliation. Marcus walked with her partway home, his presence solid and reassuring. "Don't let Victoria get to you," he said quietly. "She's been the big fish in this small pond too long. She sees you as competition. Competition for what? I'm not trying to take anything from her. You're young, you're educated, and you're married to the most powerful man in the territory. Victoria's husband might have more money, but Mercer has actual authority. That threatens her." Elena hadn't thought about it that way. "I don't want to be part of any social hierarchy. I just want to teach and be left alone." Marcus smiled sadly. "Out here, nobody gets left alone, Mrs. Mercer. We're all too dependent on each other for survival. You'll learn." He left her at the edge of town, and Elena walked the rest of the way home alone, carrying her supplies and wondering how long she could keep fighting battles on every front before something inside her broke. She found out sooner than expected. October brought the first real cold, and with it came the knowledge that Red Hollow winters were going to be brutal. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. Frost covered everything by morning. The mountains in the distance turned white with early snow. Elena had never experienced cold like this. Philadelphia winters were harsh, but she'd had a heated townhouse, heavy coats, and the option of staying indoors during the worst weather. Here, there was no escape. The schoolhouse had a small stove, but not enough fuel to keep it warm all day. Her bedroom in Mercer's house was barely warmer than outside. She woke up most mornings able to see her own breath. Mercer showed her how to bank the fire at night, how to layer her clothes, how to keep water from freezing. He taught her these things with the same clinical efficiency he'd shown when teaching her the layout of the town, useful information delivered without emotion or warmth. Their interactions were still strained, still formal. They spoke when necessary, ate meals in near silence, and otherwise existed in separate spheres within the same small house. Elena had her teaching, her students, her small world of books and lessons. Mercer had his patrols, his prisoners, his endless work maintaining order in a town that constantly threatened to slide into chaos. They were married, but they weren't partners, weren't friends, weren't anything except two people bound by a contract neither of them had truly wanted. Until the night everything changed. Elena woke to the smell of smoke. Not the normal wood smoke from fireplaces and stoves. This was different, acrid and wrong. She sat up in bed, her heart already racing, and saw orange light flickering through her window. Fire. She threw on her coat over her nightgown and ran into the main room. Mercer was already there, pulling on his boots, his face grim. "Stay inside," he ordered. "What's burning?" "Don't know yet. Just stay." "I'm not staying anywhere. If there's a fire in town, I'm helping." He looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. They ran out together into the freezing night and saw the nightmare unfolding. The western edge of town was on fire. Not just one building, 3, maybe 4, flames already leaping between structures in the dry October air. People were running everywhere shouting, trying to organize bucket brigades from the town well. But the well was too far, and the fire was spreading too fast. "Brennan's Ranch Supply Warehouse," someone shouted. "It went up first. Must have been a spark from the forge." Mercer was already moving, shouting orders, organizing the chaos into something resembling a response. "Miller, get every able-bodied man on bucket lines. Sarah, get the children and elderly to the north end of town. If this spreads, we'll need to evacuate. Marcus, where's your wagon?" "Out back." "Load it with water barrels. We need to create a fire break between the warehouse and the residential buildings, or we'll lose half the town." Elena didn't wait for orders. She ran to the bucket line, grabbed a bucket from someone's hands, and started working. The water was freezing cold, heavy, and by the third trip her arms were shaking. But she kept going, kept running back and forth between the well and the fire line, until her lungs burned and her hands were raw. The fire fought back. Every time they thought they had it contained, another building would ignite. Embers flew through the air like deadly fireflies, landing on roofs and starting new blazes. The heat was incredible. Elena's face felt scorched even from 30 feet away. Hours blurred together. At some point, Elena realized she was working next to Victoria Brennan, both of them covered in soot and ash, passing buckets with mechanical efficiency. Victoria didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge her, but they worked together anyway because the fire didn't care about social hierarchies. Dawn was breaking when the last flames were finally extinguished. 4 buildings were total losses, 3 more were heavily damaged. Miraculously, no one had died, though half a dozen people had burns that needed treatment. Elena collapsed on the ground, too exhausted to stand. Her nightgown was soaked through with water and sweat. Her coat ruined, her hands blistered. She was shivering uncontrollably from the combination of exertion, wet clothes, and dropping temperature. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders. She looked up and saw Mercer, his face blackened with soot, his eyes red from smoke. "You all right?" His voice was rough, abraded. "I think so. You?" "I'll live." He sat down next to her, moving like every muscle hurt. "You should have stayed home." "If I'd stayed home, another building would have burned. We needed every hand we could get. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You did good work tonight. Real good. It was the first genuine praise he'd given her, and Elena felt something crack open inside her chest. She was too tired to identify what it was, too overwhelmed to process anything beyond the immediate moment. Your warehouse burned, she said to Victoria, who was standing nearby directing her husband's ranch hands. I'm sorry. Victoria looked at her with an expression Elena couldn't read. We'll rebuild. That's what we do out here. She hesitated, then added, You worked hard tonight, harder than I expected. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Elena would take it. The sun was fully up now, revealing the devastation in harsh morning light. The town looked broken, wounded, but people were already moving, already planning the rebuild, already demonstrating the brutal resilience that kept frontier settlements alive. Come on, Mercer said, standing up with a grunt of pain. Let's get you home before you freeze to death. They walked back together, both of them limping, both of them too tired to speak. When they reached the house, Mercer went to the kitchen and returned with a basin of warm water and clean rags. Let me see your hands. Elena held them out, and he carefully cleaned the blisters, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who made his living with violence. His own hands were burned too. She could see raw, angry skin across his palms where he'd grabbed something hot. You need these treated too, she said. I'll be fine. Don't be stupid. Sit down. He actually obeyed, which told Elena how much pain he must be in. She cleaned his burns with the same care he'd shown her, trying not to think about how intimate this felt, how strange it was to touch him with gentleness instead of cold formality. Why did you really come help tonight? Mercer asked quietly. You could have stayed safe. Because this is my town now, Elena said. For better or worse, these are my people, and I don't abandon people when they need help. He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more open than she'd ever heard it. Your father told me you were strong, said you had more spine than most men he knew. I thought he was just talking up his daughter, trying to make me feel better about the arrangement. He met her eyes. But he was right. You are strong. Stronger than I expected. Elena didn't know what to say to that, so she just finished bandaging his hands in silence. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they sat together at the table and actually talked. Not about obligations or practicalities, but about real things. Mercer told her about growing up in Kentucky, about losing his family to cholera, about the war in Gettysburg, and how he'd ended up in the frontier territories because he couldn't go back to a place that held too many ghosts. Elena told him about Philadelphia, about her mother's slow death, about her father's desperate gambles and the slow erosion of their fortune, about Thomas Blackwell and the casual cruelty of men who measured women's worth in dowries and social connections. They didn't become friends that night, didn't fall in love or have some dramatic transformation, but the wall between them developed a crack, and through that crack, something like understanding began to seep through. It was a start. Maybe not the one either of them wanted, but it was something. And in Red Hollow, where survival was measured in small victories and hard-won progress, something was better than nothing. Winter hit Red Hollow like a fist to the gut, and Elena learned what real cold meant. The temperature dropped so far that water froze solid in its bucket overnight. The wind cut through every gap in the walls, howling across the open land like something alive and angry. Snow fell in sheets that turned the world white and made it impossible to see more than 20 feet in any direction. School became irregular. Some days half the students couldn't make it to town because the ranch roads were impassable. Other days Elena stood in the empty schoolhouse, keeping the stove burning and hoping someone would show up. She taught whoever came, whether it was 2 students or 10, and sent them home with extra assignments for the days they'd miss. The town contracted inward, everyone focused on survival. The burned buildings from October stood as blackened skeletons, their reconstruction postponed until spring, when materials could be transported and labor could work without risking frostbite. People ventured out only when necessary, moving between buildings in quick, purposeful sprints. And Elena's relationship with Mercer shifted in ways she hadn't expected. It started small. He began coming home for dinner most nights instead of eating at the saloon or making do with cold food at the jail. She started cooking, badly at first, burning beans and undercooking bread until Sarah took pity on her and provided some basic instruction. Mercer never complained, even when the food was borderline inedible. He just ate what she made and thanked her for it. They talked more. Nothing deep or personal like that night after the fire, but normal conversation. He told her about problems in town, disputes between ranchers, drifters causing trouble, the constant tension of keeping order in a place where most men were armed and tempers ran hot. She told him about her students, about the progress they were making, about Jake Thornton, who'd actually turned in a decent essay last week. "Kid's smarter than he lets on," Mercer said one night, working on cleaning his rifle at the table while Elena graded papers. His mother used to read to him every night before she died. Shakespeare, poetry, all kinds of things. He loved it back then. What happened to her? Childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. Mercer's hands moved with practiced efficiency, taking apart the rifle's mechanism. Judge Thornton never recovered. Started drinking heavy. Jake went from being a kid who loved books to being the town troublemaker in about 6 months. Elena thought about Jake's anger, his defiance, the way he pushed against every boundary she set. He's not angry at me. He's angry at the world for taking his mother. Probably, but he's still your problem to deal with. I know, I wish I could help him more. Mercer looked up from his rifle, and for a moment Elena saw something soft in his eyes. You are helping him, more than you know. He actually showed up to school 3 times this week. That's a record. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. They still kept to their separate rooms, still maintained the careful boundaries they'd established. But the space between them felt less hostile now, less like a battlefield and more like neutral ground where 2 wary people were learning to coexist. Then December brought a blizzard that trapped them inside together for 3 days straight. Elena woke on the first morning to find snow piled against the door, so high that Mercer had to dig a tunnel just to get outside. The wind was screaming, visibility was 0, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the well-insulated house felt dangerously cold. We're staying inside, Mercer said, banking the fire and pulling every spare blanket out of storage. This is the kind of storm that kills people who get stupid and try to go out in it. Elena had never felt more trapped. 3 days. 72 hours in a small house with a man she was married to but barely knew. No school to escape to, no errands to run, no excuses to maintain distance. The first day was awkward. They moved around each other carefully, making small talk that died in uncomfortable silences. Mercer tried to give her space by staying in his room, but the cold drove him back to the main room where the fire was. Elena tried reading, but she kept getting distracted by his presence, by the strange intimacy of being snowbound together. The second day was better. They played cards, poker, which Mercer taught her using matchsticks instead of money. He was surprised by how quickly she picked it up, by how good her poker face was. "Your father teach you this?" he asked after she won her 3rd hand. "He tried. I watched him play with his friends at the club, learned more from watching than from his lessons." Elena gathered her matchstick winnings. He was terrible at hiding his tells. That's probably why he lost so much. What were his tells? He'd rub his thumb against his cards when he had a good hand, and he'd talk more when he was bluffing, trying to distract people. She dealt another round. "What about you? Any tells?" Mercer smiled slightly. "If I told you, they wouldn't be very useful, would they?" They played until dark, until Elena had won most of the matchsticks, and Mercer declared her a card sharp who would have cleaned out half the saloons in the territory. The 3rd day, the wind finally died down enough that they could see outside again. The world was buried under several feet of snow, transformed into something beautiful and deadly. Mercer dug out the door fully, created a path to the kitchen building and the privy, then came back inside looking half frozen. Elena had hot coffee waiting. He took the cup gratefully, his hand shaking slightly from the cold. "Thank you. You're welcome." She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. "How bad is it out there?" "Bad. We'll need to check on people once I can get into town. Make sure everyone has enough food and fuel. Storms like this, people die from being unprepared more than from the cold itself." "I want to help." He looked at her. "It's going to be hard work. Door-to-door checks, carrying supplies to people who need them, maybe dealing with medical emergencies if someone got hurt during the storm. I can handle it." "I know you can," Mercer said quietly. "I'm just making sure you know what you're volunteering for." The next morning, they dug their way into town together. The main street was barely recognizable under the snow, buildings half buried, the whole settlement looking fragile and temporary. But smoke rose from most chimneys, which meant people were alive and keeping warm. They spent 2 days doing wellness checks. Most families were fine. Frontier people knew how to prepare for winter storms. But they found old Mrs. Patterson nearly out of firewood and too weak to chop more. They found the Kelly family, new arrivals from Missouri, dangerously low on food because they'd underestimated how much they'd need. They found Sarah Chen with a badly sprained ankle from slipping on ice, trying to keep the boarding house running despite the injury. Elena and Mercer became a team during those days. He'd handle the heavy work, chopping firewood, moving supplies, making repairs. She'd handle the people, checking for injuries, making lists of who needed what, organizing distribution of resources. They moved together with increasing efficiency, each understanding their role without needing to discuss it. Victoria Brennan watched them work from her large, well-stocked home and said nothing. But Elena caught her staring once, and the expression on Victoria's face was complicated, part resentment, part something that might have been respect. By the time January arrived, Elena had been in Red Hollow for 4 months, and she realized with some surprise that she'd stopped thinking about Philadelphia every day. Stopped measuring everything against her old life and finding the frontier wanting. The town was becoming familiar, its rhythms and patterns making sense in ways they hadn't before. She knew which families would need extra help come spring, knew which students struggled with reading and which ones were actually quite bright despite their rough education, knew which merchants were honest and which ones tried to cheat on weights and measures, knew the sound of Mercer's footsteps well enough to distinguish them from anyone else's. The crack in the wall between them had widened into something neither of them knew quite how to name. It was Sarah who finally forced the conversation. Elena was having tea at the boarding house on a rare warm afternoon in late January. Sarah had been unusually quiet, watching Elena with an assessing look that made her nervous. "You care about him," Sarah said finally. Elena nearly dropped her teacup. "What?" "Mercer, you care about him. Anyone with eyes can see it. We have an arrangement, a business arrangement. That's what you tell yourself?" Sarah leaned forward. "Elena, I've known Colt Mercer for 5 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. He doesn't look at me any particular way. He watches you like you're something precious that might break. He comes home for dinner every night when he used to eat at the saloon 6 days a week. He smiles now, actually smiles, when he talks about you to other people. And don't think I didn't notice that you've stopped wearing black. You're wearing that blue dress I helped you make." The one he complimented. Elena felt her face heating. The blue dress had been a practical decision. She needed something besides mourning clothes. The fact that Mercer had said it looked nice on her was irrelevant. Except it wasn't irrelevant, and they both knew it. "It doesn't matter how I feel," Elena said quietly. "We have an agreement. Separate rooms, separate lives, a marriage in name only. That was the deal. Deals can change. People can change." Sarah reached across the table, took Elena's hand. "You're allowed to want more than just survival, honey. You're allowed to want to be happy." "I don't even know if he wants that. He's never said anything, never indicated. Because he's waiting for you. He promised you your independence, your freedom to choose. He's not going to push, but that doesn't mean he doesn't want to." Elena went home that afternoon with her mind spinning. She watched Mercer that night with new eyes, looking for the signs Sarah had mentioned. And once she started looking, she couldn't stop seeing them. The way he made sure her coffee was hot before she woke up. The way he'd started leaving books on the table for her. Books he'd borrowed from Marcus or ordered from distant cities. Books on subjects she'd mentioned being interested in. The way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he'd started smiling more. The expression softening the hard lines of his face into something almost gentle. She was still processing this revelation when everything went straight to hell. It started with a stranger riding into town on a cold February morning. Elena was teaching when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of horses. Deputy Miller shouting something. She stepped to the window and saw a group of riders in the street, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all armed and looking dangerous. The lead rider was talking to Mercer, who stood in the middle of the street with his hand near his gun. Even from a distance, Elena could see the tension in his posture. "Kids, stay in your seats," Elena said, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "Don't go near the windows." But Jake Thornton had already moved to look outside. His face went pale. "That's Silas Kane's brother, Clayton Kane, the whole Kane gang." Elena's stomach dropped. Silas Kane. the outlaw Mercer had captured during the stagecoach robbery. The man who'd been sitting in the Red Hollow jail for the past 4 months waiting for the circuit judge to arrive and sentence him to hang. "Stay here," Elena ordered. "All of you, don't leave this building for any reason." She ran outside, ignoring her own advice, ignoring the danger, because Mercer was out there alone facing 7 armed men, and even he couldn't survive those odds. She got close enough to hear the conversation. "Transfer him to territorial custody yesterday," Mercer was saying, his voice hard. "Silas is in Cheyenne now. You're too late." Clayton Kane laughed. He was bigger than his brother, meaner looking, with eyes that suggested he enjoyed violence for its own sake. "You think I'm stupid, Sheriff? You think I don't know you're lying? My brother's still in that jail and I'm here to collect him. Even if he was here, you'd have to go through me to get him." "That can be arranged." Clayton's hand moved to his gun. "In fact, I think I'd enjoy it. Silas told me all about how you shot up our gang, killed 3 good men. You got a debt to pay, Mercer." Elena reached Deputy Miller, who was standing helplessly on the boardwalk, his rifle in his hands but his face showing he knew how outmatched they were. "Where are the other men?" Elena whispered urgently. "Where's Samuel Brennan? Marcus Chen? Anyone who can shoot?" "Brennan's at his ranch. Won't make it here in time. Marcus is in the back of his store. I can see him through the window. He's got a rifle, but he's alone. Rest of the men are scattered. We're on our own." Elena's mind raced. 7 against 2. Or 3, if Miller actually had the courage to fight. Mercer was the best shot in the territory, but even he couldn't take all of them before someone got him. Unless they had a distraction. "Stay here," Elena told Miller. Then, before she could think better of it, before fear could paralyze her, she walked directly into the street. "Mrs. Mercer, get back inside." Mercer's voice cracked with something that might have been fear. She'd never heard fear in his voice before. "Actually, Mr. Kane," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady despite her hammering heart, "your brother isn't in Cheyenne. He's still in our jail. The sheriff was telling the truth earlier this week, but the transfer got delayed because of the weather. Silas is about 50 feet from here, behind those walls." Every eye turned to her. Clayton Kane's expression shifted to something calculating and cruel. "Well now," he said slowly. "The sheriff's wife. How convenient." He looked at Mercer. "Silas mentioned you got hitched. Said you bought yourself a pretty little eastern bird. Didn't mention she was stupid enough to walk into a standoff." "Let her go," Mercer said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is between us. She's got nothing to do with it." "But see, that's where you're wrong." Clayton swung down from his horse, his gun drawn. "She's got everything to do with it now. Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to unlock that jail, hand over my brother, and then you and me are going to have our discussion about what you did to my men. And your wife here is going to stand right where she is and make sure you cooperate. Because if you don't," he pointed his gun directly at Elena's chest. "Well, I'm sure you can imagine." Elena saw Mercer's face change, saw something cold and murderous flash in his eyes, saw his hand move fractionally toward his gun. "Don't," Clayton warned. "You're fast, Mercer. Everyone knows it. But you ain't faster than 7 of us. You draw, we all shoot, and your wife dies before you drop your first target. That what you want?" The silence stretched impossibly long. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 7 guns pointed in her direction. This was worse than the stagecoach robbery. This was worse than anything she'd imagined. Then Deputy Miller did something unexpectedly brave. He stepped off the boardwalk, his rifle raised, positioning himself so he could cover some of the gang members from a different angle. "Seems like the odds just changed a bit," Miller said, his voice shaking but determined. Clayton laughed. "A kid deputy and a woman. Real impressive backup, Sheriff." But Elena saw it, saw the calculation in Clayton's eyes. 2 shooters in different positions made this more complicated. Not impossible, but riskier. Then Marcus Chen stepped out of his store, rifle in hand. Then old Pete Dawson from the livery, holding an ancient shotgun. Then, to Elena's shock, Victoria Brennan appeared on the second-floor balcony of her home, holding what looked like a very expensive hunting rifle. The odds were shifting, and Clayton Kane knew it. "Last chance, Sheriff," Clayton said. "Give me my brother or this town burns, starting with your wife." Elena saw Mercer's jaw tighten, saw him weighing options, calculating odds. She knew with absolute certainty that he was about to give in, about to surrender Silas to save her life. She couldn't let that happen. "Mercer," she said clearly, "don't you dare." He looked at her, real fear in his eyes now. "Elena, if you give them Silas, they'll kill us anyway. They'll kill you, burn the town, and probably kill me just for the fun of it." She forced herself to meet Clayton's eyes. "Isn't that right, Mr. Kane?" Clayton's smile was ugly. "Smart girl. So there's really only one choice here." Elena's voice was steady, though her hands were shaking. "We fight." "Elena, don't stop." She pulled the derringer from her skirt pocket, the same one she'd carried during the stagecoach robbery, the one she'd never fired. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pointed it directly at Clayton Kane's chest. "2 shots," she said. "At this range, I won't miss. You're right that 7 guns are more than 2. But can you shoot the sheriff before I put both these bullets in you? Are you that fast?" The street went absolutely silent. Clayton stared at her, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation to something that might have been respect. "You got spine, lady, but you're bluffing. Eastern women don't shoot people." "This one does," Elena said. And she meant it. She would absolutely pull this trigger if it meant protecting Mercer, protecting this town she'd somehow started thinking of as home. Clayton saw the truth in her eyes, saw that she wasn't bluffing. "Interesting," he said. Then he raised his voice to his men. "New plan, boys. We're going to take the sheriff's wife with us. Use her to negotiate Silas's release from a safer distance. How's that sound?" Before Elena could react, before anyone could move, Clayton lunged forward and grabbed her, his arm locking around her throat, his gun pressing against her temple. The derringer fell from her numb fingers. "Don't!" Clayton shouted as Mercer started to move. "I'll blow her head off right here, I swear to—" Elena didn't think, didn't plan, just moved on pure instinct, doing something her father had taught her when she was 16 after a man had tried to assault their housemaid. She stomped down hard on Clayton's instep with all her weight. His grip loosened fractionally, just enough. She threw herself sideways, turning her body away from his gun, using her elbow to drive into his stomach with everything she had. Clayton stumbled backward, surprised. Elena hit the ground hard, and Mercer moved. She'd never seen anyone move that fast. His gun was out, firing before Clayton could recover his balance. The shot caught Clayton in the shoulder, spinning him around. Then Mercer was firing at the other gang members, working the action on his revolver with inhuman speed. The street exploded into chaos. Guns firing from every direction. Miller was shooting, Marcus was shooting, Victoria's rifle cracked from above. Elena scrambled behind a water trough, her ears ringing, her body shaking with adrenaline. She saw one of the Kane gang fall, saw another grab his leg and go down screaming, saw Clayton trying to get to his horse, still clutching his wounded shoulder. Then she saw one of the gang members draw a bead on Mercer, who was reloading and didn't see the threat. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her fallen derringer, aimed and pulled the trigger. The small gun barked. The shot went wide. She'd never actually fired it before, didn't know how it would kick, but it was close enough to make the gang member flinch, to throw off his aim. His shot hit the dirt 3 feet from Mercer instead of his chest. Mercer finished reloading, turned, and put 2 rounds in the man before he could correct his aim. It was over in less than a minute. 3 of the Kane gang dead, 2 wounded and unable to fight, 1 running for his horse. Clayton Kane was on his knees, blood soaking through his shirt, his gun 20 feet away. And 1 gang member had gotten to his horse and was riding away at full gallop. Mercer let him go. Instead, he walked to where Elena was still crouched behind the water trough, helped her up with hands that were remarkably steady given what had just happened. "You hurt?" His voice was rough. "No. You?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment, and Elena saw something raw in his eyes. "You could have died. You walked right into that. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking you needed help. I was thinking 7 against 1 were bad odds." Her voice cracked. "I was thinking I couldn't just stand there and watch them kill you." Mercer pulled her against his chest, and for the first time since their wedding, Elena let herself lean into him, let herself shake, let herself feel the terror she'd been suppressing. His arms came around her, solid and warm, and she could feel his heart hammering as hard as hers. "You're the bravest damn fool I've ever met," he said into her hair. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." People were emerging from buildings now, checking the wounded, securing the prisoners. Deputy Miller was pale and shaking, but alive. Marcus had a graze on his arm, but was already helping Victoria climb down from her balcony. Sarah ran up to Elena, grabbing her shoulders. "Are you insane? You could have been killed." "I know. Don't you ever—" Sarah stopped, looked at Elena's face, then at Mercer's. Oh, I see." Elena didn't ask what she saw. Didn't need to, because standing there in the middle of a street still smelling of gunpowder, wrapped in the arms of a man she'd married out of obligation and desperation, Elena finally understood what had been growing between them these past months. Somewhere between the fire and the blizzard, between card games and quiet conversations, between survival and partnership, she'd stopped thinking of Colt Mercer as the sheriff who'd bought her as payment for a debt. She'd started thinking of him as her husband, her partner, someone she trusted with her life, someone she was falling in love with. And that realization was more terrifying than anything Clayton Kane could have done to her. The aftermath of the gunfight lasted for hours. Clayton Kane and his surviving men were locked up in cells that were suddenly crowded with outlaws. Deputy Miller rode out to summon the territorial marshal, which would take at least 2 days. The dead were laid out in the undertaker's shed, and the town buzzed with the story of how the sheriff's eastern wife had walked into a standoff and changed everything. Elena didn't feel like a hero. She felt nauseated and shaky, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold a cup of tea when Sarah forced one into her grip. "Drink," Sarah ordered, sitting beside her in the boarding house parlor where they'd retreated after the bodies were cleared. "You're in shock." "I shot at someone," Elena said numbly. "I actually pulled the trigger. You saved Mercer's life. That man would have killed him. I missed. The shot went wide. I'm a terrible shot." "You distracted him long enough that Mercer could finish the job. That's what matters." Sarah squeezed her hand. "You did good, Elena. You were brave. I was stupid. Mercer said so himself. He said you were a brave fool. There's a difference." Sarah smiled slightly. "And the way he looked at you after— I wasn't imagining that, was I?" Elena closed her eyes. She could still feel his arms around her, still hear the roughness in his voice when he'd called her brave, still remember the raw fear in his eyes when Clayton had grabbed her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered. "I don't know what this is or what it's becoming. Maybe you should ask him." "I can't. We have an agreement, boundaries. If I cross them and he doesn't feel the same way, see." "Elena," Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "That man stood in the middle of 7 guns because he wouldn't let them take you. He was ready to trade a prisoner he'd spent 4 months hunting just to keep you safe. You really think he doesn't feel something?" But feeling something and wanting to change their arrangement were 2 different things. Elena had been the one to demand separate rooms, separate lives. She'd been the one to make him promise he wouldn't touch her. If she went to him now and said she'd changed her mind, would he think she was just grateful for being rescued? Would he think she was weak or manipulative or desperate? Would he even want her the way she was starting to want him? She went home that evening to find Mercer at the table, cleaning his guns with methodical precision. He looked up when she entered, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his face. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you." "Can't. Not until the marshal gets here and takes custody of the prisoners." He went back to his work, his movements automatic. "Kane's going to hang. So will the others. What they did today, attempted murder of a lawman, assault, attempted kidnapping, that's enough to see them executed." Elena sat down across from him. "Does it bother you, knowing they'll die?" "No." His voice was flat. "They chose this life. They knew the risks." He looked up at her. "What bothers me is that you almost died today because I couldn't control the situation, because I let them use you against me. You didn't let them do anything. I made my own choice to walk into that street. A choice you shouldn't have had to make." He set down the gun he'd been cleaning, his expression dark. "I'm supposed to protect this town, protect you. And instead, you did protect me. You protected everyone." Elena reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close. "Mercer, if you'd given them Silas, they would have killed us all anyway. You know that." "Maybe. But at least you would have been alive for a few more minutes. At least I wouldn't have watched Clayton put a gun to your head and known there was nothing I could do about it." His voice cracked slightly. You don't understand what that felt like. Then tell me. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. When I saw him grab you, when I saw that gun against your temple, I understood something I'd been avoiding for months. I understood that losing you would destroy me in ways that nothing else could. Not the war, not my family dying, not all the violence I've seen. Losing you would be worse than all of it. Elena's breath caught. Mercer, I know we have an agreement. I know you wanted space, wanted independence, and I've tried to respect that. But I can't keep pretending this is just some business arrangement anymore. He finally met her eyes. I care about you, Elena. More than I should, more than I planned to. Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely think. Since when? Since you stood in that burning town and worked until your hands bled. Since you refused to quit teaching even when the kids were awful to you. Since you played poker with me during that blizzard, and I realized I'd rather be trapped in a storm with you than free anywhere else. He laughed bitterly. Hell, maybe since the first time I saw you on that stagecoach, looking terrified but holding that derringer like you'd actually use it. I don't know, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about your father's debt and started being about you. Elena couldn't find words. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning. I'm not asking you to change anything, Mercer continued quickly. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I needed you to know. After today, after almost losing you, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Elena could hear the wind outside, could hear the crackle of the fire in the next room, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. What if I told you, she said slowly, carefully, that I do feel the same way? Mercer went absolutely still. Elena, what if I told you that I've been terrified for weeks because I realized I was falling in love with you and I didn't know what to do about it? The words were tumbling out now, unstoppable. What if I said that when I saw those guns pointed at you today, the only thing I could think was that I couldn't lose you? That somewhere in these horrible, difficult months, you became the most important person in my life? He stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. You love me? I think so. Yes. I don't know when it happened exactly, but somewhere between hating you for that contract and watching you protect this town and learning that you're actually kind underneath all that hardness. Yes, I love you. She laughed shakily. Which is probably the stupidest thing I've ever admitted, considering you just told me you care about me, not that you love me. And now I've made this incredibly awkward. Mercer stood up so fast his chair fell over. He crossed to her side of the table in 2 strides, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her. Elena had been kissed before. Chaste kisses from Thomas Blackwell, calculating and proper. This was nothing like that. This was fierce and desperate, and full of months of suppressed wanting. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite the intensity, and she grabbed his shirt to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mercer rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said roughly. I've loved you for months. I just didn't think I had the right to say it. Why not? Because you married me out of desperation, not choice. Because I trapped you with that contract. Because you deserve better than a frontier lawman who kills people for a living. Elena pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. You gave me a choice. You offered to let me walk away. And I stayed. Maybe at first it was because I had nowhere else to go, but that changed. I stayed because I wanted to. Because you're honest and brave and you protect people who can't protect themselves. Because you're a good man, Colt Mercer, whether you see it or not. He kissed her again, softer this time, like he was memorizing the moment. Your room or mine? He asked against her lips. Elena's face heated. We should probably talk about not for that. Not unless you want to. He pulled back, his hand still gentle on her face. But I don't want to sleep alone anymore. I don't want to keep pretending we're strangers living in the same house. I just want to hold you. If you'll let me. The vulnerability in his voice undid her completely. Your room, she said. It has the bigger bed. They moved together through the small house, and Elena felt like she was seeing everything with new eyes. This wasn't a prison anymore. It was home. Their home. Mercer's room was as sparse as she'd expected, just a bed, a trunk, a washstand. But the bed had clean sheets and thick blankets, and when they lay down together, still fully clothed, Elena felt safer than she'd felt since her father died. Mercer pulled her against his chest, his arms solid around her, and Elena listened to his heartbeat and marveled at how completely her life had changed in 6 months. "Tell me about your father," she said quietly. "Your real father, not just the war stories." So he did. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, about a father who'd been a blacksmith and a mother who'd taught him to read, about siblings lost to cholera before Colt was old enough to save them, about the loneliness that had driven him west after the war, looking for something he couldn't name. Elena told him about her mother's love of music, about how their Philadelphia house had always been full of piano melodies and laughter before the sickness came, about her father's desperation to save his wife, the way grief had hollowed him out when he failed. They talked until late into the night, sharing histories they'd kept locked away. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the darkness, Elena realized that this was what marriage was supposed to be. Not contracts and obligations, but choice and trust, and the slow, careful building of something real. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, a grizzled man named Dawson, who looked like he'd been doing this job for 30 years and was tired of all of it. He took custody of Clayton Kane and the surviving gang members, listened to witness statements, and nodded approvingly at Mercer's handling of the situation. "Good work, Sheriff. The territory needs more lawmen like you." Dawson looked at Elena with interest. "And I heard your wife played a part in this. Walked right into the standoff?" "She did." "Brave woman. Stupid, but brave." Dawson smiled slightly. "You're lucky to have her." "I know," Mercer said, and the way he looked at Elena made her face heat. After the marshal left with his prisoners, life in Red Hollow returned to something resembling normal. The burned buildings from October were finally being rebuilt now that spring was approaching. School continued, and Elena's students had started looking at her with new respect after the gunfight. Even Jake Thornton was turning in consistently good work. And Elena's relationship with the town shifted in subtle but important ways. Victoria Brennan invited her to tea, an invitation that was clearly significant given their history. Elena accepted, curious about what the older woman wanted. Victoria's house was as impressive as Elena had imagined, full of expensive furniture and decorations that must have cost a fortune to transport. But sitting in the elegant parlor, drinking tea from fine china, Elena realized that all this luxury couldn't hide the loneliness underneath. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said without preamble. "I've been cruel to you since you arrived. Deliberately cruel." Elena was too surprised to respond. "I saw you as a threat," Victoria continued. "Young, educated, married to a man with real power. I'd worked very hard to establish myself as the social leader of this settlement, and suddenly there was competition. I never wanted to compete with you. I know that now. I saw it during the fire, during the gunfight. You're not interested in social climbing or status. You actually care about this town and its people." Victoria smiled sadly. "You're a better woman than I am, Mrs. Mercer, and I was wrong to treat you the way I did." "I appreciate that," Elena said carefully. "I'd like to start over if you're willing. The territory needs women like us to work together, not against each other. There's too much to do, schools to build, communities to strengthen, children to educate." Victoria extended her hand. "Friends?" Elena shook it. "Friends." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, wasn't some emotional scene. Just two women deciding to stop wasting energy on hostility and start building something useful instead. But in Red Hollow, that counted as progress. March brought the first real warmth, and with it came news that would change everything. Elena was teaching when Deputy Miller arrived at the schoolhouse looking nervous. "Mrs. Mercer, there's a man at the jail asking for you. Says he's from Philadelphia. Has some legal documents you need to see." Elena's stomach dropped. Philadelphia. Legal documents. Nothing good ever came from that combination. She dismissed the students early and walked to the jail with a sense of dread. A man in an expensive suit was waiting in Mercer's office, looking deeply uncomfortable with his surroundings. He stood when Elena entered. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm Thomas Garrett, attorney at law. I represent the estate of Harrison Whitmore." Elena's father. Her dead father, who'd apparently left more surprises even from beyond the grave. "What is this about, Mr. Garrett?" The attorney pulled papers from his briefcase. I've been searching for you for months, Mrs. Mercer. Your father's estate has been in probate, and we've discovered some assets that were previously unknown to his creditors. Elena's heart started beating faster. What kind of assets? Your grandfather, Harrison's father, established a trust for his grandchildren before he died. The trust was managed by a bank in New York, separate from your father's finances. When Harrison died, we assumed the trust had been depleted. It wasn't. The principal has been growing untouched for 23 years. He handed her a document. Elena read it once, then again, certain she was misunderstanding. This says there's $42,000? $42,316 to be precise, plus interest accruing monthly. The trust specifies that the funds go to you upon your father's death or your 25th birthday, whichever comes first. Since your father passed last year, the funds are now yours. Elena couldn't breathe. $42,000. It was a fortune. More than most people in Red Hollow would see in their entire lives. Enough to go anywhere, do anything, be completely independent. Enough to leave. There are papers to sign, Garrett continued. Once we verify your identity and process the transfer, the funds will be available to you. I've taken the liberty of arranging for the money to be transferred to the bank in Cheyenne, where you can access it more easily. How long? Elena's voice came out strangled. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. The legal processes take time. Garrett smiled. But I assure you, Mrs. Mercer, your financial troubles are over. You're a wealthy woman now. After Garrett left, Elena sat alone in Mercer's office, staring at the papers in her hands. $42,000. Freedom. The ability to go anywhere, be anyone, live however she wanted. The ability to leave Red Hollow and never look back. She should be ecstatic, should be celebrating. 6 months ago, this would have been a miracle, an answered prayer. But now, sitting in this rough frontier office in a town she'd once despised, Elena felt nothing but confusion and fear, because leaving meant leaving Mercer, leaving the life they'd started building together, leaving the students who needed her, the friends she'd made, the home she'd created from nothing. And she didn't know if she could do it. Mercer found her there an hour later, still holding the papers. He read them in silence, his expression carefully neutral. $42,000, he said finally. That's a lot of money. Yes. You could go back east, buy a house in Philadelphia, live comfortably. You'd never have to worry about money again. I know. He set the papers down and Elena saw something complicated in his eyes. Happiness for her, fear for himself, and a deep sadness he was trying to hide. You should go, he said quietly. This is your chance to have the life you should have had, the life you deserved before your father's debts took it away. What if I don't want that life anymore? Elena. He ran a hand through his hair, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. I can't ask you to stay. I won't. You stayed before because you had no choice. Now you do. And if you choose to leave, I'll understand. I'll let you go without a fight. What if I don't want you to let me go? Her voice cracked. What if I want you to ask me to stay? That wouldn't be fair. You need to make this decision on your own, not because I guilt you into it. Elena stood up, walked around the desk, and grabbed his shirt in both hands. Colt Mercer, you are the most frustratingly noble man I've ever met. I'm not asking you to guilt me into anything. I'm asking you to tell me how you feel, to tell me what you want. He looked at her for a long moment, war waging across his face. Then something broke, and he pulled her against him. I want you to stay, he said roughly. I want you to choose this life, choose this town, choose me. Not because you're trapped or desperate, but because you actually want to, because you love me the way I love you. His arms tightened around her. But I also want you to be happy. And if leaving makes you happy, if going back east is what you really want, then I'll help you pack, and I'll put you on that stagecoach myself, even if it kills me to do it. Elena pulled back enough to see his face. I need time to think about this. Take all the time you need. But that night, lying in bed beside him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, and listening to him breathe, Elena already knew what her answer would be. The question wasn't whether she'd stay. The question was whether she had the courage to admit that Red Hollow, this rough, violent, beautiful frontier town, had become more of a home than Philadelphia ever was, and that Colt Mercer, The dangerous lawman who'd once terrified her had become the man she couldn't imagine living without. She spent the next week in a haze of indecision, going through the motions of teaching while her mind churned with possibilities. $42,000 represented freedom, security, opportunity. But it also represented a choice she'd never thought she'd have to make. Sarah noticed her distraction immediately. "You're thinking about leaving." "I don't know what I'm thinking." "Yes, you do. You're just scared to admit it." Sarah set down her sewing. "Let me ask you something. When you imagine your future, what do you see?" Elena closed her eyes, tried to picture herself back in Philadelphia, in a nice house with nice things, attending nice parties with nice people who would never fully accept her because of her father's scandal. The image felt hollow, false. "I see Red Hollow," she admitted. "I see the schoolhouse and my students. I see Mercer coming home at night. I see a life here." "Then why are you struggling with this?" "Because staying means giving up security. Giving up the chance to live comfortably, safely. The winters here almost killed me. The violence is constant. People die from things that wouldn't even be serious back east." Elena's voice cracked. "What if I choose to stay and then regret it? What if I wake up in 10 years and realize I made a terrible mistake? What if you leave and spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been?" Sarah countered. "Elena, there's no safe choice here. Either decision comes with risks. The question is which risk you're willing to take." That night, Elena made her decision. She found Mercer in the kitchen, and the look on her face must have told him everything because his expression closed off immediately, bracing for impact. "I'm staying," she said. He went absolutely still. "Elena, I'm using the money to improve the school, to buy proper books and supplies, maybe hire another teacher so we can educate more children. I'm going to invest some of it in the town, help rebuild the structures that burned, maybe help families who are struggling. And I'm keeping enough to make sure we're secure so you don't have to risk your life quite as often just to make ends meet. You don't have to." "I'm staying because I want to," Elena continued, her voice firm. "Not because I'm trapped or because I have no other options. I'm staying because Red Hollow is my home now, because these people are my people, because you are my husband, and I love you, and I choose this life." Mercer crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed her with an intensity that stole her breath. When they broke apart, she could see tears in his eyes. "You're sure?" His voice was rough. "Because once you make this choice, once you invest that money here, it'll be hard to take it back." "I'm sure. Even though the winters are brutal and the town is rough and I'm gone for days, sometimes chasing outlaws? Even though all of that," she smiled. "I'm tougher than I look, Sheriff. I thought you'd learned that by now." He laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine, and picked her up, spinning her around in the small kitchen like they were dancing. "I love you," he said when he set her down. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good," Elena said, "because you're stuck with me now, for real this time. No contracts, no obligations, just choice." That night, they made love for the first time. Tentative and awkward at first because they were both nervous, but then with increasing confidence as they learned each other's bodies. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Elena felt more certain than she'd felt about anything in years. This was right. This was home. This was the life she was meant to live. The next morning, she sent word to Thomas Garrett that she'd accept the inheritance but wanted it transferred to the Red Hollow Territorial Bank. She signed the papers, made arrangements, and then went back to teaching like nothing monumental had just happened. But something had changed in Red Hollow. People had watched her choose to stay when she could have left, watched her invest her fortune in their town instead of her own comfort. And slowly, grudgingly, the last walls of resistance crumbled. Elena Mercer wasn't an Eastern outsider anymore. She was one of them. A frontier woman who'd earned her place through survival, sacrifice, and choice. And standing beside Colt Mercer, watching him work to keep their town safe, Elena finally understood what her father had seen in him. Not just a man who kept his promises, but a man who would protect what he loved with everything he had. A man worth building a life with, even when that life was hard and dangerous and nothing like what she'd planned. Especially because of that. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were real in ways Elena's Philadelphia life had never been. She learned that loving someone didn't erase the hard parts. Mercer still left for days at a time, chasing outlaws across the territory, and Elena still spent those nights lying awake, listening for the sound of his horse returning. He still came home with injuries, bullet wounds, knife cuts, broken ribs from fights she didn't want to imagine. And she still had to clean those wounds with shaking hands, pretending she wasn't terrified of losing him. But she also learned that real partnership meant showing up anyway, meant tending his injuries even when she was angry at him for being reckless, meant having arguments about whether a particular manhunt was necessary, then making up afterward because they both knew the job came with the badge, meant building something together that was messy and complicated and nothing like the fairy tales she'd read as a girl. The school expansion happened in stages. With Elena's investment, they built a proper schoolhouse. 2 rooms instead of 1, with real desks and a library of actual books, instead of the handful of worn primers they'd been sharing. Elena hired a second teacher, a young woman named Margaret Collins, who'd come west from Ohio with teaching credentials and the same desperate need for a fresh start that Elena had once felt. The children came in greater numbers once word spread that Red Hollow had a real school. Ranch families who'd been teaching their children at home started sending them to town. Even some of the mining camps in the surrounding hills began bringing their kids in for education, rough boys and girls who'd never seen the inside of a classroom, but who proved surprisingly hungry for learning. Jake Thornton graduated at 17, the first student to complete the full curriculum Elena had established. He stood in front of the whole town, his drunk father notably absent, and gave a speech about frontier education that brought tears to Elena's eyes. 2 months later, he left for Denver to attend university on a scholarship Elena had quietly arranged. Judge Thornton never thanked her, but Jake sent her letters describing his classes, his dreams of becoming an attorney, his determination to come back and help the territory. "You're changing lives," Mercer told her one night, reading over her shoulder as she composed a reply to Jake's latest letter. "You know that, right? You're giving these kids futures they never would have had." "We're changing lives," Elena corrected. "None of this works without you keeping the town safe enough that families want to stay." He kissed the top of her head. "We make a good team, Mrs. Mercer." They did. But that didn't mean everything was perfect. Their first real fight happened in the 2nd year of their marriage, when Mercer accepted an appointment as territorial marshal. It meant more responsibility, more danger, more time away. Elena found out when Deputy Miller mentioned it casually, assuming she already knew. She waited until Mercer came home that night, then confronted him in the kitchen. "Were you planning to tell me about the marshal position, or was I supposed to just figure it out when you disappeared for weeks at a time?" Mercer set down his hat carefully. "I was going to tell you." "When? After you'd already accepted?" "I accepted 2 days ago. I've been trying to find the right time to bring it up." "There's no right time for something like this, Colt. You just tell me." "That's how marriage works. We talk about important decisions before making them, not after." His jaw tightened. "It's my career, Elena. My choice. I didn't think I needed permission from my wife to advance in law enforcement. I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for respect, for consideration. Do you have any idea what it's like waiting for you to come home, wondering if each goodbye might be the last one?" Her voice cracked. "I'm not trying to control you. I just want to be part of the conversation when you make decisions that affect both our lives." They stood there in the kitchen, tension crackling between them, both too stubborn to back down immediately. Then Mercer exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. "You're right. I should have talked to you first. I didn't want you to try to talk me out of it." "Would you have listened if I had?" "Probably not, but you deserve the chance to try." He moved closer, his expression softening. "I'm sorry. I'm not used to having someone to answer to. I'm not used to my choices affecting anyone but myself." "Well, you do now, so get used to it." Elena's anger was fading, replaced by exhaustion. "I'm not asking you to turn down the position. I know it's important to you, and you'll be good at it. I'm just asking you to include me in these decisions, to trust me enough to talk to me before the choice is already made. I do trust you, more than anyone." He pulled her into his arms and she let him, because being angry was exhausting and she'd rather be held. "I'll do better. I promise." He tried. They both did. But marriage turned out to be harder than either of them had anticipated, full of small conflicts and adjustments. Elena had to learn that Mercer's silences didn't mean he was angry, just processing. Mercer had to learn that Elena needed words, needed communication, needed him to actually tell her what he was thinking instead of expecting her to read his mind. They fought about money, Elena wanting to invest more in the community, Mercer worried about keeping enough in reserve for emergencies. They fought about his work schedule, about her tendency to take on too many projects, about whether they should expand the house or save for the future. They fought like any married couple, and they made up like any married couple, and slowly they learned how to navigate each other's rough edges. The town grew around them. Red Hollow's population doubled, then tripled. New businesses opened, a proper hotel, a newspaper, a telegraph office connecting them to the wider world. The burned buildings were long since rebuilt, replaced by sturdier structures that could withstand the harsh winters. Streets were graded, boardwalks installed, a town council established to handle civic matters, and Elena found herself at the center of it all in ways she'd never expected. As the marshal's wife and the town's primary educator, she had influence. People listened when she spoke at town meetings. When she proposed a fund for widows and orphans, the community contributed. When she suggested establishing a lending library, volunteers appeared to help organize it. When she quietly mentioned that certain businesses were cheating customers, those businesses suddenly became very honest. Victoria Brennan became an unexpected ally in all of this. The two women formed a partnership that confused many people. The refined Southern belle and the practical Eastern teacher working together to civilize a frontier town. They established a women's auxiliary that provided support for struggling families, organized social events that brought the community together, and quietly intervened in cases of domestic violence or abuse. "We make quite the pair," Victoria said one afternoon, tallying donations for the Winter Relief Fund. The society queen and the gunfighter's wife, ruling Red Hollow from behind the scenes. Elena laughed. "I don't think we're ruling anything. We're just helping. Don't sell yourself short, dear. You have more power in this town than you realize. People respect you. Fear you a little too after that business with the Kane gang." Victoria smiled. "Use that power wisely, and we can do real good here." They did. Between Elena's education initiatives and Victoria's social organizing, Red Hollow transformed from a rough settlement into something resembling actual civilization. It would never be Philadelphia or New Orleans, would never have opera houses or museums or the refinements of Eastern cities. But it had schools and safety and a community that looked after its own. The third year brought changes Elena hadn't planned for. She missed her monthly courses in September, then again in October. By November, Sarah took one look at her face and said, "You're pregnant." Elena sat down hard on the nearest chair. I haven't told Mercer yet. I wasn't sure." "You're sure now. I've seen enough pregnant women to recognize the signs." Sarah squeezed her hand. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "I watched my mother die from childbirth complications with a baby that didn't survive. I know what can go wrong, and out here without proper medical care, we have Dr. Chen now. He's delivered dozens of babies, and he's good at what he does. You'll be fine." But Elena wasn't sure she would be. The frontier killed women in childbirth regularly. She'd seen it happen to ranch wives, to miners' daughters, to women stronger and tougher than she was. The thought of bringing a child into this harsh world, of risking her own life in the process, filled her with a fear she couldn't quite shake. Mercer took the news with characteristic stoicism, his face carefully neutral as Elena told him. Then he pulled her close, and she felt him trembling. "Are you happy about this?" she asked quietly. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I'm terrified of losing you. I'm terrified of being a father. I'm terrified of bringing a child into a life where I might not come home one day." His arms tightened around her. "But I'm also, I'm happy. Scared as hell, but happy." They were scared together through the winter months as Elena's belly grew. Dr. Chen examined her regularly, pronounced her healthy, and assured them both that everything was progressing normally. But Elena still woke some nights in a panic, convinced something was wrong, and Mercer would hold her until she calmed down. "My mother used to say that becoming a parent meant your heart lived outside your body for the rest of your life," Elena told him one night, feeling the baby kick inside her. "I never understood what she meant until now. I already love this child so much it hurts, and I haven't even met them yet." "Then we'll protect them together," Mercer said, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "Whatever it takes." Their daughter was born on a warm May evening, after 16 hours of labor that left Elena exhausted and Mercer looking like he'd aged 10 years. But when Dr. Chen placed the tiny, screaming baby in Elena's arms, everything else fell away. She was perfect, impossibly small, with dark hair like her father's, and lungs that proved she was absolutely furious about being born. Elena counted her fingers and toes, marveled at the tiny fingernails, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "She's beautiful," Mercer whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She looks like you." "She looks like us," Elena corrected. She looked up at her husband, saw tears on his face, and felt her own eyes burning. "What should we name her?" They discussed names for months, but never settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter's face, Elena knew exactly what felt right. "Rose, after my mother." She glanced at Mercer. "Rose Margaret Mercer, if that's all right with you." "It's perfect." He touched the baby's tiny hand, and Rose immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Rose. I'm your father, and I promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe." It was a promise Elena knew he'd keep or die trying. Parenthood changed everything and nothing. Mercer was still the territorial marshal, still gone for days chasing criminals across Wyoming and Montana. But he came home faster now, pushed harder to finish cases, turned down assignments that would take him too far from Red Hollow for too long. And when he was home, Elena watched him transform from the feared lawman into a father who sang lullabies off-key and paced the floor at 3 a.m. with a colicky baby. "You're good at this," Elena told him one night, watching him rock Rose back to sleep after a feeding. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "Neither do I, but we're figuring it out together." She leaned against his shoulder, the three of them forming a small, imperfect family in the darkness. "That's all anyone can do." Rose grew into a fierce, curious toddler who inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's intelligence. At 2 years old, she could already recite her letters and was attempting to read simple words. At 3, she was following Elena to the schoolhouse and sitting in on classes, absorbing information like a sponge. At 4, she announced she wanted to be a marshal like her daddy, which made Mercer laugh and Elena sigh. "You can be anything you want," Elena told her daughter. "Marshal, teacher, doctor, anything. The world is changing, Rose. By the time you're grown, women will be able to do things my mother never dreamed of." "Can I shoot a gun like Daddy?" "When you're older, and if you prove you're responsible enough to handle one safely." "Can I help catch bad guys?" "Let's focus on learning to read first, and we'll discuss bad guys later." But Rose was growing up in a world very different from the one Elena had known. She was learning that women could be strong, that they could fight and lead and make their own choices. She was learning from her mother's example that education was power, and from her father's that sometimes protecting people meant standing up to violence with controlled force. She was learning to be a frontier woman, tough, capable, and unafraid. The town council approached Mercer when Rose was 5, offering him a promotion to Chief Territorial Marshal for the Wyoming region. It meant better pay, more authority, the chance to shape law enforcement policy across the entire territory. It also meant being based in Cheyenne, the territorial capital, and leaving Red Hollow behind. This time, Mercer came home and discussed it with Elena before making any decisions. They sat up late that night, weighing options. Cheyenne offered more opportunities for Rose, better schools, more culture. The position was prestigious and important. It was everything Mercer had worked toward for 15 years. "But you don't want it," Elena said, reading his face. "I don't know. Part of me does. It's a chance to make real change, to improve how law enforcement works across the whole territory." He stared into his coffee cup. "But Red Hollow is home. The people here know us. Rose knows every family in town. You've built something important with the schools. And I keep thinking about what it would mean to leave all that behind." "What does your gut tell you?" He was quiet for a long time. "My gut says that some opportunities aren't worth taking if they cost you the things that actually matter. That titles and prestige don't mean much if you're living somewhere you don't want to be, doing work that takes you away from your family more than you already are." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. "Then turn it down." "You sure? This is a big decision for both of us." "I'm sure. Red Hollow needs you. I need you. Rose needs you. And sometimes the bravest thing isn't taking the bigger job. It's knowing when to say no because you already have what matters." He turned down the promotion, and Elena watched him do it without regret. They stayed in Red Hollow, and life continued in its familiar rhythms. The years accumulated like snowdrifts, slowly at first, then suddenly piling up, until Elena looked around and realized a decade had passed since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. Terrified and desperate, and certain the frontier would destroy her. Rose turned 10, then 12, then 14. Two more children followed, a son named Harrison after Elena's father, and another daughter they called Margaret after Elena's first teaching assistant who'd moved on to start a school in Denver. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and suddenly Elena understood her mother's old comment about hearts living outside your body. She had 3 of them now, running wild through Red Hollow, learning and growing and becoming their own people. Mercer's hair started showing gray at his temples. His movements slowed slightly, the accumulated injuries of decades of law enforcement work catching up with him. But he was still the marshal, still the man people called when there was trouble, still the bedrock of law and order in the territory. And Elena had become something she'd never expected, a pillar of the community, a woman whose opinion carried weight, whose approval mattered, whose schools were producing educated young people who went on to universities back east and then returned to build the West into something better than it had been. Jake Thornton came back, now a lawyer, and set up practice in Red Hollow. Several of Elena's other former students returned as well, teachers, doctors, engineers, bringing skills the territory desperately needed. The investment she'd made 15 years ago in education was paying dividends she'd never fully anticipated. "You're building a legacy," Mercer told her one evening, watching her review applications for teaching positions at the school's 3rd building. "You know that, right? Long after we're gone, people will remember what you built here." "We built," Elena corrected automatically. "None of this happens without you keeping the peace, creating the stability that lets communities grow." "Maybe. But the schools are yours, the library, the women's auxiliary, the scholarship fund. That's all you." He pulled her away from her paperwork, drew her into his arms. "I'm proud of you, in case I don't say it enough." "You say it plenty." She leaned into him, marveling at how natural this felt after all these years. "I'm proud of us, of what we've built together." Because that was the truth she'd learned slowly over 16 years of marriage, that the best things weren't built alone. That partnership meant showing up for each other through the hard times, celebrating the victories together, and accepting that neither of them was perfect, but together they were enough. The final piece of the story came on a cold November evening when Mercer came home from the marshal's office looking troubled. "There's a lawyer in town," he said, hanging up his coat. "Thomas Garrett. Says he has some information about your father that you should know." Elena's stomach dropped. Thomas Garrett, the same attorney who'd found her 16 years ago with news of her inheritance. She hadn't heard from him since. "What kind of information?" "He wouldn't tell me. Said it's something you need to hear directly from him." They met in the marshal's office the next morning. Garrett looked older, more tired, but his eyes were sharp as he pulled documents from his briefcase. "Mrs. Mercer, I've spent years piecing together your father's final affairs. There were complications, secrets he kept even from his closest associates." Garrett spread papers across the desk. "I thought you should know the full truth about the debt that brought you west." Elena's hands clenched. "I know about the debt, $5,000 for my mother's medical care." "That's partially true. But there's more to the story." Garrett pulled out a letter, yellowed with age. "This was in your father's effects, sealed and marked to be opened only after his death. It's addressed to you." Elena took the letter with shaking hands. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years. She broke the seal and began to read. The letter explained everything. How Harrison Whitmore had watched his daughter grow into a woman in Philadelphia's suffocating society, surrounded by men like Thomas Blackwell, who saw her as a possession rather than a person. How he'd feared for her future, knowing that his gambling debts would leave her vulnerable to predators once he died. How he'd researched carefully, looking for someone he could trust to protect his daughter if he couldn't. And how he'd found Colt Mercer, not through gambling debts or desperate loans, but through deliberate choice. The $5,000 had indeed paid for Elena's mother's care. But Harrison had borrowed it specifically from Mercer, had insisted on the marriage contract, had created this entire arrangement because he believed that a frontier lawman with unshakable integrity was the only man who would give his daughter a real chance at a good life. The letter ended with words that made Elena's eyes burn. "I know you'll be angry when you discover the truth. I know you'll feel manipulated, controlled, but Elena, my darling girl, I wasn't trying to trap you. I was trying to set you free. The frontier is harsh, but it's honest. And Colt Mercer is the most honest man I've ever known. He won't break you or diminish you or try to make you small to fit society's expectations. He'll let you be as strong as you actually are. That's the greatest gift I could give you, the chance to become the woman you were always meant to be. Trust me, my daughter. Trust him. And forgive me for not being brave enough to tell you this while I was still alive to see your anger. I love you more than you'll ever know. Your father. Elena sat in silence for a long time after finishing the letter, tears streaming down her face. Mercer took it from her shaking hands, read it himself, and then set it down carefully. Your father played us both, he said quietly. The debt was real, but the contract, he engineered the whole thing to get you out here. He knew, Elena whispered. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't desperate or gambling or making a mistake. He chose this. Chose you. Chose my future before I even knew I needed it. Garrett cleared his throat. There's more. Your father left detailed instructions for how the inheritance was to be managed. He specifically requested that I wait until you'd been in Red Hollow for at least a year before revealing its existence. He wanted you to build a life here first, to make the choice to stay because you wanted to, not because you had no other options. Elena laughed through her tears, understanding flooding through her. He gave me the illusion of being trapped, so I'd stay long enough to realize I wanted to be here. And then he gave me the money so I could choose freely. Your father was a complicated man, Garrett said, but everything he did was because he loved you and wanted you to be happy, even when his methods were questionable. After Garrett left, Elena and Mercer sat together in the office, processing the revelation. Are you angry? Mercer asked. I don't know. Yes? No? Maybe? Elena wiped her eyes. I'm angry that he didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I'm angry that he manipulated us both. But I understand why he did it, and I can't be too angry about a manipulation that gave me the best years of my life. You think these have been the best years? She looked at him, at the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the strength that hadn't diminished even as his body had aged. I left Philadelphia as a spoiled debutante who thought fancy dresses and social status mattered. I became someone real here, someone strong, someone who makes a difference. She took his hand. My father knew I needed that, knew I needed you, and he was right, even if his methods were terrible. For what it's worth, I think he did you a favor. And me too. Mercer smiled slightly. I never thought I'd have this. A family, a real home, someone who loves me despite knowing exactly what I am. Your father gave me that, even if I didn't know that's what was happening. They went home together that evening and told their children the full story over dinner. Rose, now 16 and sharp as her mother had ever been, listened carefully and then said, So grandfather manipulated you into a marriage that turned out to be perfect for both of you, but you're mad because you didn't get to make the choice yourselves? It's more complicated than that, Elena started. Is it, though? Rose looked between her parents. You're happy. You love each other. You built something important here. Would you change any of it if you could go back? Elena and Mercer exchanged glances. The answer was obvious. No, they said simultaneously. Then maybe the lesson isn't that grandfather was wrong. Maybe the lesson is that sometimes the people who love us see things we can't see ourselves, and sometimes being pushed into something scary turns out to be exactly what we needed. Rose grinned. Besides, if grandfather hadn't sent you west, none of us would exist. So I'm voting we forgive him. Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that adults spent years learning. The years continued their steady march forward. Rose went to university in Chicago, then came back with a law degree and a determination to reform territorial justice system from the inside. Harrison followed his father into law enforcement, becoming a deputy marshal at 22. Margaret became a doctor, inspired by the frontier's desperate need for medical care. And Elena and Mercer grew old together in the house they'd built, watching Red Hollow transform from a rough settlement into a thriving town, then a city. The schools Elena had founded expanded into a full education system. The law enforcement structure Mercer had helped create brought stability that allowed communities to flourish. They sat together on their porch one evening in their 60s, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, and Elena found herself thinking about that terrified woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 30 years ago. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Mercer asked, reading her mind the way he'd learned to do over decades of marriage. "Not even a little bit." Elena leaned against his shoulder. Philadelphia was beautiful and cultured and dead inside. "This place is rough and dangerous and more alive than anywhere I've ever been. I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Not even for an easier life?" "Easier isn't better. We earned this life, Colt. We built it from nothing, from debt and desperation and a contract neither of us wanted, and we turned it into something real, something that matters." He kissed the top of her head, and Elena closed her eyes, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. They'd survived stagecoach robberies and gunfights, brutal winters and devastating fires, the challenges of parenthood and the slow accumulation of time. They'd fought and made up, struggled and persevered, changed and grown together. "Your father was right, you know," Mercer said quietly, "about setting you free. The frontier didn't trap you. It showed you who you really were underneath all those Philadelphia expectations." "We showed each other," Elena corrected. "I wouldn't have survived out here without you. Wouldn't have become this person without you pushing me to be stronger than I thought I could be. And I wouldn't have learned how to be human again without you. Wouldn't have remembered there was more to life than just surviving." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "We saved each other, Elena. That's the truth of it." Maybe that was the real lesson hidden in her father's manipulation, Elena thought. That sometimes the strongest partnerships came from the most unlikely beginnings. That obligation could transform into choice. That desperation could become determination. That a marriage built on debt could become a love story that outlasted everything the frontier threw at it. The West had tested her in ways Philadelphia never could have. Had broken down the soft, sheltered woman she'd been and rebuilt her into someone stronger, someone capable. Someone who could stand beside a dangerous man and become dangerous herself when the people she loved needed protecting. And in return, she'd given the West something it desperately needed: schools and structure, education and civilization, the steady work of building communities that could last beyond the rough pioneer years. 40 years after that first stagecoach ride, Elena Mercer stood at the dedication of Red Hollow's new university, a full institution of higher learning built on the foundation she'd laid with a single one-room schoolhouse. Dozens of her former students attended, now teachers and lawyers and doctors themselves. The town that had once been 200 people barely surviving in the wilderness now held 20,000, with paved streets and electric lights and all the markers of progress. Mercer stood beside her, now in his 70s but still straight-backed and sharp-eyed. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, a whole family tree grown from that desperate contract signed in a Philadelphia office by two men trying to protect a woman they both loved. "You did it," Mercer said, watching the ceremony. "You built something that will outlast us all." "We did it," Elena corrected for the 1,000th time. "And it wasn't about outlasting anything. It was about building something worth having while we were here to see it." Because that was the final lesson the frontier had taught her. That legacy wasn't about grand monuments or lasting forever. It was about showing up every day and doing the work. Teaching the students who needed teaching. Protecting the people who needed protecting. Loving the person standing beside you, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when it would have been easier to walk away. It was about choosing every single day to build something real instead of something easy. Elena looked at the university, at the thriving city, at the family she'd raised and the community she'd helped shape. She thought about the scared woman who'd once believed the frontier would destroy her, and she smiled. The frontier hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her. Had stripped away everything false and shown her what she was actually made of: strength and stubbornness, love and loyalty, the kind of fierce determination that could survive anything if given a reason to fight. And Colt Mercer had been that reason. The dangerous lawman who'd become her partner, her love, her home. The man who'd kept his promise to her father and given her something more valuable than safety, the freedom to become whoever she wanted to be. "I love you," she told him, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd said them in fear and wonder all those decades ago. "I love you," he replied, taking her hand in his weathered one. "Always have, always will." They stood together watching the celebration, two people who'd been thrown together by circumstance and debt, who'd chosen each other across years and hardship, who'd built a life worth living in the harshest, most beautiful land on earth. And if Elena could go back and tell that terrified woman on the stagecoach what her future held, she'd say this: sometimes the worst moments lead to the best lives. Sometimes being trapped is the first step toward freedom. Sometimes the person you least expect becomes the person you can't imagine living without. The frontier taught hard lessons, but it taught true ones. And Elena Mercer had learned them all, through blood and fire, through love and loss, through the daily work of building something lasting in a place that tried to tear everything down. She'd learned that home wasn't a place you were born. It was a place you chose, a place you fought for, a place you built with your own hands and heart. And standing there in the city she'd helped create, beside the man who'd helped her become herself, Elena knew with absolute certainty that she'd chosen right. The frontier hadn't stolen her freedom. It had given her everything: purpose and strength, family and love. A life so full and real that she couldn't imagine having lived any other way. Sometimes the harshest journeys led to the only home the heart was ever meant to find. And sometimes, just sometimes, the contract you never wanted became the greatest blessing you'd ever receive.